In this video, I'm going to be looking at the pattern of deployment of toxic batches. The COVID vaccine was deployed in batches or lots, and each lot has a number. The batches are listed in the VAERS database in the order in which they were created. And the VAERS database also records the adverse reactions for each batch. Consequently, it was possible to make a graph plotting the adverse reactions along the vertical axis and the sequence of batches in time order along the x-axis. In this way, I was able to see the patterns of deployment of the toxic batches over time. I was also able to see which companies were responsible and when, and I was able to deduce the purpose of their activities. You're going to be astonished at what you will read. It's a revelation of sorts. You will see behind the curtain. Here is a graph of all the reported batches in VAERS in their time sequence and with their associated adverse reactions over the year 2021. So this is all the batches represented on a graph in 2021 in the order in which the batches were deployed, and on the vertical axis showing the number of adverse reactions for each batch. So each dot is a batch. Take a moment to look at what you can see. About 95% of the batches lie very close to the x-axis in this thick line here. These batches are all relatively harmless, generating only a handful of adverse reactions per batch. In fact, 80% of all the batches generate only one or two adverse reaction reports and so are harmless. All these harmless batches are found close to the x-axis. And now for the shock. All the clouds of dots and these spikes of dots, all of these dots above the x-axis, all of these clouds and spikes are toxic batches. Yes, all of them. Okay, you probably need a moment to let that sink in. Maybe take a breath or two. We'll get more into what these spikes and clouds mean later. For now, I'll just give you a statistical breakdown. 5% of all the batches belong to these clouds and spikes. The really toxic ones generate 1,000 to 5,000 adverse reaction reports and are found above this red line. These batches have been found to consistently cause adverse reactions, disabilities, deaths and hospitalizations in every state right across the USA. Wherever they are deployed, wherever they are dispensed, they cause harm. So these are the really toxic batches here. Luckily, these batches above the red line only comprise about 0.65% of all the batches So there's only a 1 in 200 chance that your vaccine shot will come from one of these. A lesson learned. If you have been lucky so far, then don't carry on rolling the dice. So the total number of batches deployed in 2021 and recorded in VAERS is 28,330. As mentioned above, 80% of the batches are harmless, generating only 1 or 2 adverse reaction reports per batch, and they all lie inside this thick line along the x-axis. However, 1 in 200 batches are very toxic, generating 1,000 to 5,000 adverse reaction reports, and these are all of these dots here above the red line. So that's the end of lesson 1, and now we'll go to lesson 2. Who did it? The name of this lesson is Who Did It? In this lesson, what we're going to find out is which companies did which bits of the deployment of the toxic batches. Once again, it will be a bit of a surprise, a bit of a shock. Knowing who did what is actually a lot simpler than Cluedo, because there are only 3 companies involved in the deployment of vaccines in the USA: Moderna, Pfizer, and Janssen & Janssen. These are the only 3 that show up in the VAERS reports. In order to see the contribution that each had on the deployment of toxic batches, I simply filtered the manufacturer column and selected each company in turn. No big deal. Of course, you'll need to do this in Excel after downloading the database. You can't do it using the more public control panel. You have to download the data into Excel. Anyway, here are the results for Moderna, Pfizer and Janssen. And firstly, we're going to look at the full picture again. So here's the full picture. Now, here are the results just for Moderna, and you'll notice how Moderna accounts for every single vaccine batch in the first half of chart 1. This is the total picture, and you'll notice that the Moderna accounts for every single vaccine in the first half of this chart, except for 2 mysterious spikes before and after the Moderna batches. This spike and this spike, which it turns out were produced by Janssen and Janssen. And here are the results for the Pfizer batches. Notice that this is just Pfizer alone, plotted from VAERS, and it exactly matches the latter half of the first chart. It's very remarkable that the Pfizer batch distribution is identical to the latter half. It appears as if Pfizer completely took over supply of every single batch of vaccine in the USA. I'll give the reason later for that. And it's also interesting how each company appears to be working along with the others so that no one intrudes on the other's slot. Notice how Janssen abruptly stops, and then Moderna starts, then Moderna stops all toxic batches, and then Janssen starts, and then Pfizer starts. And at this point, Moderna completely leaves the picture and does absolutely no more batches. And so Pfizer begins. here. Anyhow, the results are quite unexpected because I would have rather expected that the deployments from each company would be intermingled and spread out. Instead, what we have is carefully compartmentalized deployments from each company. So these are carefully compartmentalized deployments. As I said, it looks like they're all being organized from above so that no one intrudes on the other's operations or time slot. That's the end of that lesson. Now we're going to look at what the patterns mean. Okay, initially there was a preliminary test by Janssen. Prior to this test, there were harmless batches were deployed, and then suddenly and rather abruptly, Janssen deploys about 18 highly toxic batches, all very closely very close in time, in close temporal succession, and with a toxicity up to 2,000 times the toxicity of the previous harmless batches. The introduction of the toxic batches begins very abruptly, and then it ends and they resume harmless batches again. Then Moderna steps in and is distributing harmless batches, but intermingling them with all of these toxic batches. They start deploying toxic batches almost immediately, and they're interspersed with harmless batches. The toxic batches are mostly in the same range as the Janssen spike. Above this range, they fade out and become much less frequent. So it looks as if the Janssen may have done a preliminary test run, which was then taken up by Moderna, who produced all of their toxic vaccines, mainly within that range of 0 to 2,000, with some fading out above. Towards the end of Moderna's time slot, it looks like Moderna had quite a bit of vaccine it wanted to deploy, quite a lot of toxic vaccine, and that's why there's much greater concentration of toxic batches just here towards the end of their time slot. And then straight after, Moderna resumes harmless batches all the way to here. So these are all harmless. Again, it's just completely stopped distributing toxic batches. However, Janssen does a second test. This time it's in the same, it goes up to the same maximum of 2,000, but it's in a narrower range of 1,000 to 2,000. So it looks as if Janssen has by this time learned how to focus the toxicity into a specific target range, 1,000 to 2,000 times the base toxicity. They're achieving a narrower spread, avoiding the less potent and therefore more wasteful lower range, 0 to 1,000. So Janssen's becoming more precise. Then there's a long period here of only harmless batches distributed by Moderna. During this time, it looks as if the companies were creating a clear baseline before the subsequent testing, which I'll go into a bit later. Moderna exited the picture completely at this point, and Pfizer steps in. Pfizer being the German company. It looks as if Pfizer carries out a series of linear dosage tests. So what's really extraordinary is how these three companies were acting in relay with each other. It really is odd. It's as if all careful, monitored dosage testing was allocated to the Germans, while Moderna was given the initial job of randomly dispersing toxic batches. Why was Pfizer brought in? As you will see in the following, Pfizer was brought in to carry out rigorous dosage testing, deploying the most lethal batches systematically and recording and monitoring the effects. In order to do this effectively, they had to be the only company administering batches of vaccine. There could be no interference from other companies like Moderna, which would only mix and cloud the results. So Pfizer took over complete control of the vaccination program in the USA. It's as if all carefully monitored dosage testing was allocated to the Germans. The delegation of dosage testing to Pfizer was most likely because Moderna was uncomfortable about testing on their own people, and it would be safer to involve an outside party for this nasty work. Moderna employees might waver in the face of applying toxins to their own friends and neighbours, and it only takes one leak. The purpose of Moderna's deployment of toxic batches. Moderna randomly distributed its toxic batches. In contrast, it looks as if Pfizer deployed its batches with far more control under strict testing conditions, as will be described in the next lesson. The purpose of the Moderna, therefore, was not to monitor or measure, since the deployment looks random and uncontrolled. Rather, it seems the deployment of toxic batches was simply to harm, possibly for the purpose of inducing fear of a pandemic and justifying stronger policies. The initial spike by Janssen that preceded the Moderna deployment looks like a test of the 2,000 times dosage before Moderna released it upon the public. Here ends Lesson 3. Lesson 4. The fine art of lethal dosage testing. ACA, establishing the lethal limit without telling your experimental animals. Here's a close-up of the deployment of all the batches by Pfizer in the USA, which followed the Moderna deployment. Now, Pfizer deployed about 9,500 batches of COVID-19 vaccine in the USA. And curiously, the toxic batches that they deployed do not appear randomly arranged in time. Rather, they cluster together in time, forming discrete periods of application, clusters. So we have the cluster here, another cluster there, another cluster there, another cluster here, another cluster here, and another cluster here. And we could say there's a cluster here, but this one is less precise. But certainly all the others are highly clustered together in time, so they don't appear random at all. These clusters in between are punctuated by equally wide periods of total calm, or rather the total absence of toxic batches. In other words, only harmless batches are being deployed in between the clusters, which is odd again, because if this was random, you'd expect kind of lots of intermediate, randomly dispersed, randomly scattered batches, but no, it goes highly toxic, serotoxic, highly toxic, serotoxic, highly toxic, serotoxic, highly toxic, and it's like a non-random distribution. Okay, and the transition between cluster and calm is, and the transition between the cluster of toxic batches and the periods of harmless batches is always abrupt. Also, the toxic batches don't appear to be randomly arranged in terms of their toxicity. Just as the batches cluster in time, they also cluster in toxicity, falling into discrete ranges. For example, here's a range, then here's a range, then here's a range, then here's a range. In fact, all the ranges are about the same distance between the minimum and maximum. So here we have the range is in 2,000 to 3,000 times. Then this range here is in about 1,500 to 2,500. And this one here is in the range 1,000 to 2,000. And this one here is in the range, well, it's possibly 0 to 1,500, though it could be 500 to 1,500. Either way, it's a very nice linear decline that we can see in the dosages that they were administering. So the toxic batches do not appear to be randomly arranged in terms of their toxicity. Batches that cluster in time also cluster in toxicity, falling into discrete ranges that are distinct from the other clusters. So that's another odd thing, why the range here should be discrete and distinct from the range here. If this was random, and the range here is different from that one, and the range here is different from that one. Furthermore, the toxicity ranges of sequential clusters decrease in a stepwise manner rather than as a continuous slope. And these steps follow a linear decline. Okay, yes, so if the toxicity was random, we would expect it to not necessarily go down in steps, but rather just a continuous slope, perhaps. But these are in steps. It's steps of 500. All these characteristics can be observed in the chart below, and they suggest that Pfizer was involved in deploying highly toxic batches of vaccine to every state of the USA for the purpose of identifying effective doses, effective, that is, for their purposes. Thousands of citizens will have been hospitalized, injured, disabled and killed by these toxic batches. This was a medical experimentation upon the people of America, young and old alike, many of whom are still suffering in tremendous pain to this very day. So I've gone over the appearance of the chart. So just to sum up, the medical experiment by Pfizer. Many characteristics of this deployment suggest that they were carrying out discrete dosage testing. 1. Highly toxic batches clustered together in close temporal proximity. They appear in clusters close to each other in time. These sequential clusters are abruptly separated by clear periods during which only harmless batches are deployed. The toxicity of these toxic batches is not random, but rather is clustered into narrow ranges of toxicity. The clusters of batches occupy ranges of toxicity that are distinct from one another and follow a stepwise linear decline, each step being equal in size and punctuated by a clear period of harmless batches. The batch steps were in sequential order 3,000 times, 2,500 times, 2,000 times, and 1,500 times. Here, that's the end of my presentation, and what you've seen is not just that the demonstration that batches are not all of equal toxicity, but I've also shown throughout the presentation that the deployment of these toxic batches often is not random. They appear abruptly, they appear in a systematic way, time slotted for each company, and also cease just as abruptly, just like Janssen's ceased suddenly and resumed harmless batches, just as Moderna ceased all of its toxic batches and resumed a long period of harmless batches. And then Pfizer launches in with dosage testing at a very high toxic level, and then decreases it systematically in steps of 500 in a linear, stepwise fashion. So it's not just that batches vary in toxicity very, very widely. 80% are relatively harmless, only producing 1 or 2 adverse reaction reports. The remainder can have toxicity up to 5,000 times the majority of the batches. And these toxic batches seem to have been deployed systematically and deliberately upon the American people. It's ironic that America, the erstwhile victors of the Second World War, should finally fall victim to medical experimentation carried out by the Germans.